You need a strong state that is essentially based on competence, meritocracy, zero tolerance for corruption, and the metrics in place to do that. And that, I think, is the China formula. And not many countries can follow that.
西方最喜欢用一个词结束中国讨论，威权。可问题是，如果中国只是他们说的那样，如果它真的只是专制、控制，没有自由，那过去40年，从粮票、煤炉、贫穷到今天的工业体系、城市建设、科技制造，又该怎么解释？ Chandran Nair 这条访谈真正有价值的地方，不是他替中国说好话，而是他把西方叙事里被删掉的那一层摆出来。中国不是没有制度，而是这套制度不按西方习惯运行。更狠的是，他最后总结了一套中国公式：强国家、能力、任人唯贤、反腐、共同体治理。然后他说，很多国家学不来。
I'm Eric Olander. Last year, I gave a talk at a university in Singapore where it just so happened that almost the entire audience I was speaking to was from China. These were all students. Part of my presentation included a series of photos when I was a student traveling in Beijing and Shanghai way back in the 1980s and the early 1990s. And what was so fascinating was to see the reaction on their faces, on these kids' faces, to these pictures that to them just made them laugh, and they just marveled at, because the world depicted in those photos might as well have been from the 16th century. China back then was poor. And I mean, it was really poor. When I lived with a family there in Beijing for a short period back in the late 1980s, we had to use ration coupons for food. Virtually no one had cars, and there were very few personal luxuries. In fact, the house that I stayed at was heated in the very cold Beijing winters just because of a pile of coal that was dumped on the street in front of the house. You went out with a bucket, scooped up some coal, put it into that bucket and brought it back inside and put it into a furnace. That's how a lot of houses back then were heated in Beijing. Now, this made no sense to these kids in Singapore that day who grew up in a country that is now one of the most advanced in the world, and personal luxuries are everywhere. They never knew that country that I lived in all those years ago, which is why they found it so perplexing that this wasn't ancient history. These changes in China happened within my lifetime over the past 40 years. While China's opening up and modernization has brought enormous wealth and improved the quality of life of its people, it's also triggered a lot of anxiety in other parts of the world, namely in the US and...
先看一个背景。主持人回忆自己80、90年代去中国，那时中国很穷，粮票、烧煤取暖，几乎没有私家车。可是几十年之后，中国年轻人再看那些照片，像在看几百年前的世界。这个对比很重要，因为中国的变化不是传说，也不是宣传片，而是在一代人的时间里发生的现实。你可以不喜欢中国制度，你也可以批评中国问题，但你不能假装40年巨变没有发生。所以西方真正尴尬的地方在这里，他必须解释中国为什么变了，但他给出的解释很多时候不是理解，而是防御。
Put out something as the Club of Rome China to help a world that was curious about China, particularly in the West, where there is curiosity yet misplaced understanding, fear, and all of those things that you described earlier, and that it needed to be written in a way that, a 21-year-old as well as a 50-year-old politician could understand it. And it was not a tome that would take you months to read. You could read it almost in 2 sittings, and the language is pretty simple and all the core issues. So that's that I just want to make that qualification.
Sure. Well, what do you want people to understand? Again,
the misunderstanding, and I've written the book on the basis of my lived experience as well of China and watching the world at large. And the misunderstanding that somehow China is some sort of tyranny run by a bunch of autocrats, and that there is no freedoms at all, and that it continues to be a place in which people can't flourish, and that the state is all powerful, and that it cheats, etc. All of those things that we've heard about. You've even, I think, rightly said that in Europe and in the USA, there's a feeling that China has had grown at their expense, which is a rather sort of rich thing for Europeans and Americans to accuse another country of. So to try and get people to understand that this is a civilizational state, profound in its understanding of its role in the world, clearly with shortcomings too, and the book does explain those shortcomings, but it is a civilizational state that is essentially recognized its past failings and where it was too weak, and it had to create stability. And through a system of meritocracy, which I described in the book in terms of the governance systems, etc., rooted in its civilization and culture, has embraced the world. And I also think it's important, and I again want to be politically neutral here, get people to understand that the evidence to date is that China is not a state looking to essentially, and there are people who will look at things.
他们说中国靠控制，说中国靠作弊，说中国没有自由，人民无法发展。可如果这些标签足够解释中国，那中国就不该有今天的产业规模、基础设施、教育扩张和城市治理。奈尔的反驳不是说中国完美，他很清楚中国有缺点，但他强调中国首先是一个文明型国家，有自己的历史记忆、治理逻辑和国家目标。这句话听起来抽象，其实很关键。西方总想把中国塞进一套很窄的政治分类里，像不像西方选举？像就是正常，不像就是不正常。但中国不是这样运行的。他提到任人唯贤这个词，如果讲不好，很容易变成口号。但在这里，它其实是一个很现实的问题。中国这么大的国家，靠什么选拔干部？靠什么让政策从中央落到地方？靠什么让地方政府不只是喊口号，而是真的把事情做出来？如果不理解这一层，就会出现一种很矛盾的说法：一边承认中国几十年里完成了工业化、基建、扶贫和产业升级，一边又说中国没有治理能力。这两句话放在一起，本身就说不通。
Things like Tibet and all of those things. And these are issues to be talked about. But China is not an expansionist state that the rest of us will have concerns about its size, particularly us in Southeast Asia. But I don't think there's a view, and this needs to be shared, that, China's going to come and take over Malaysia or Vietnam and things like that. So that's also very important to understand. And that's what I wanted people to understand. And it's like any other government going to any other state going through a huge amount of challenges and trying to, raise the well-being of its people and meeting all sorts of challenges in a very complex, globalized world.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the book, I understood everything that you said, and I share a lot of your views, but do you understand where the anxieties come from in the West, particularly for the working class that feel that they have lost their jobs, they're less competitive now, and that anxiety.
更重要的是，奈尔还把中国和扩张威胁区分开。他说，到目前为止，中国不是一个要接管马来西亚、越南的扩张型国家。中国真正面对的问题，首先是如何在复杂全球环境里提高人民福祉。这句话不是说中国没有外部影响，也不是说周边国家不需要谨慎。它真正打破的是西方那个默认逻辑，只要一个非西方国家变强，它就一定会复制西方当年的霸权路线。西方最喜欢把自己的历史投射到别人身上，因为他们当年强大之后是殖民、扩张、掠夺，所以他们本能地认为别人强大之后也会这么干。可奈尔提醒的是，中国未必按这套剧本走。
But that whole narrative that you just described, again, came from the neoliberal economic model of the West, right? That this is how economics works. This is how countries work. And I think China is actively seeking to break that for its own self, for the reasons you described, so that they don't leave behind these people and then get a whole disenfranchised, lower economic rung of people who that would be a recipe for breakdown, which as we see, is what I call, the sort of low intense kind of civil war that's happening in Europe, in the USA, where you've got all these disenfranchised people and political elites exploiting both spectrums. So, as you pointed out, and I went to China and saw in the previous life I had as a consultant doing a lot of due diligence, etc., the arrival of the investments in China, the due diligence being done, the conversion of the state enterprises to these joint ventures with companies like GE and all of those. And China went along that because it had to lift as many people as possible. Then we saw the peak of manufacturing, which I'm sure you're very well versed in. And I think, it depending on how you want to look at the numbers, it peaked maybe about 15 years ago, the peak of manufacturing. And then we saw people essentially having to move back to the rural areas. And then you saw the Chinese policy of revitalization of the rural areas, putting very smart people to it. I think this is a challenge for all our countries. As a Southeast Asian and as a Malaysian, I warn our governments about this sort of, single track trajectory towards tech dominated economies and forgetting the most basic things. And so I think, as you said, sticking to the lower end is important, but more importantly, what I see is redefining what meaningful employment looks like, and therefore what fiscal and monetary policy can look like in the Chinese context. So, in that sense, I think you will agree with me that for many parts of the world, the trajectory with regard to where climate is going, what all the resource constraints are doing, means that one of the most important industries going forward will be actually food production and food security. And that cannot hinge on the industrial model that was exported around the world and perfected, particularly in the United States. We're going to have to do something different because we have to use labor with all the population that we have in the rural areas and use labor as an input rather than the entire mechanization and chemicalization of our food supply chains. So I think
接下来他谈到一个更深的层面，中国正在试图打破西方经济脚本。按照西方发展叙事，一个国家升级以后就应该把低端制造丢掉，转向高科技、金融和服务业。可是中国一边做新能源、通信、汽车、自动化，一边还保留大量基础制造。为什么？奈尔的解释很现实，如果你把底层产业和底层人群一起甩掉，社会就会撕裂。欧美今天很多问题，不就是大量普通人被全球化、金融化和产业空心化甩出去之后，变成了政治愤怒吗？所以中国治理真正难的地方，不只是造高铁、造电动车、造大城市，而是产业升级的时候，怎么不让一大批人变成被抛弃的人。这就是为什么他会提到乡村振兴、粮食安全、有意义的工作。中国不是只问怎么在高科技上赢美国，还要问这么多人以后靠什么生活？农村怎么办？粮食怎么办？低收入群体怎么办？这些问题纯市场模型给不出完整答案。这时
So, if the Prime Minister of Malaysia, the President of Vietnam, the President of Botswana come to you and say, Chandran, you've studied China. What is the lesson that we can take from what China did to apply to our countries in the global south that are still heavily agrarian, much the way that China was back in the late 1970s when paramount leader Deng Xiaoping started the reform and opening up period? What would you tell them based on your book and your life experiences?
No, that's a great question, Eric. And, in fact, before I even thought about this book and with my colleagues, I wrote a book, which you might probably know is called The Sustainable State. And that's formed the genesis of much of my arguments and about where our region and developing countries in Africa go. And I would say to them, to your question first, China has succeeded, and I believe all countries need to succeed not using the China model, but the principles of essentially in the era we live in of having a strong state. And that, but by that, in the West, it's typically seen as being authoritarian, but essentially a competent state capable of long-term planning. And so when I talk about the book, that the Chinese strength has been meritocracy, and that's also civilizational. And we've had a series of global conversations that we've done around China where we've had Chinese experts and others talk about and something that I would like people to understand in this conversation about the importance that the Chinese place on meritocracy. And I won't compare it with leaders from Europe, something like that. So the best people go and work with the state. Second is essentially the whole issue of a communitarian view of the role of government and service. And this is a premium in China. There are certainly examples of people who have abused it. You and I know about that. But the fundamental thing is it's a society based on a communitarian system of governance, that you achieve results because you serve society and you do that. And third has been, in my view, and I know this as I traveled through Southeast Asia and people say, how do they deal with the corruption thing so well? And they all know that, especially in the last 12 years or 10 years with President Xi, there has been a real focus on getting rid of corruption. And so you take all of those three ingredients and you've got essentially what, in my view, and I've worked in Southeast Asia a lot. I also lived in Africa. I don't know if you're aware. And those are the conclusions I came to in my first book on the sustainable state. You need a strong state that is essentially based on competence, meritocracy, zero tolerance for corruption, and is communitarian and has a method and a governance system that essentially puts communitarian needs and the metrics in place to do that. And that, I think, is the China formula. And not many countries can follow that. It's understanding fear and all of those things that you described earlier, and that it needed to be written in a way that, a 21-year-old as well as a 50-year-old politician could understand it. And it was not the tome that would take you months to read. You could read it almost in 2 sittings, and the language is pretty simple and all the core issues. So that's that I just want to make that qualification.
Sure. Well, what do you want people to understand? Again, lecturing process. What makes China unique here, though, and it's unprecedented in many respects, is that as they're moving up the value chain, making some of the most advanced telecommunications, new energy, automation, EVs, all of this, they're still holding on to making the flip-flops, the T-shirts, and ceramics, for example, at the low end. Now, China's facing a number of challenges at the same time that you also bring up in the book in terms of demographics and its population that doesn't really want to work in factories too much anymore. Talk to us about the challenges of holding on to the bottom end of the manufacturing at the same time as undergoing a demographic change where there may not be enough people or a will to work in those low-end jobs.
Yeah, I think I'll be careful as I frame this.
这时主持人提出一个全球南方最关心的问题：如果马来西亚、越南、博茨瓦纳这样的国家来问中国成功能学什么，奈尔的回答很克制，他没有说照抄中国模式，而是说要学习原则，强而有能力的国家长期规划，任人唯贤。这里有一个很大的反差，西方一听强国家马上翻译成威权，但对很多发展中国家来说，弱国家才是真正的灾难。国家没有能力，腐败压不住，基础设施建不起来，产业政策推不动，教育医疗落不下去，最后所谓自由也只是少数精英的自由。所以全球南方看中国和欧美看中国完全不一样。欧美担心的是中国会不会挑战他们的优势，很多发展中国家真正关心的是我能不能把路修起来，把电供上，把学校办好，把腐败压下去，把产业留在本国。对他们来说，一个没有能力的国家再会讲漂亮话也解决不了现实问题。奈尔说，中国的强项是让优秀的人进入国家系统，然后是共同体治理，再加上强力反腐。反腐说起来简单，真正动刀的时候，触碰的是利益网络，是官僚系统，是地方权力，是整个国家机器能不能重新建立纪律。所以他最后总结，中国公式是强国家、能力、任人唯贤、零容忍腐败、共同体治理。然后他说，很多国家学不来，这才是这一期最重要的点。中国模式不是写几条政策就能复制，它背后有文明传统、组织体系、干部选拔、基层治理、政治纪律，也有长期规划和试错能力。你可以批评它的问题，但你不能假装它没有逻辑。西方真正不舒服的也不是中国没有制度，而是中国证明了现代化不一定只有西方一条路。所以这期的结论不是中国完美，也不是西方一无是处，真正的结论是，如果西方只会用自己的尺子量中国，他看到的永远不是中国，而是自己不愿承认的焦虑。中国让西方最难受的地方，不是他强了，而是他强起来以后还没有变成西方想象中的样子。